Darth Vitiate consumed 2 entire worlds, and for more than 1,000 years, no one understood how far his power actually reached. He operated under different names through separate empires, and the galaxy never realized they belonged to the same being. In the final days after the Great Hyperspace War shattered the old Sith Empire and scattered its survivors into exile, Vitiate summoned the remaining Sith Lords to Nathema, the world Mark Aragnos had granted him. These were the survivors of the most devastating war the Sith had ever fought, and many of them were powerful enough to have carved out their own empires. Vitiate dominated every one of them at once, binding their wills to his own and channeling their combined strength into a ritual unlike anything the galaxy had seen. More than 8,000 Sith reduced to fuel for a single act of consumption. The ritual held him in place while it drained each lord's connection to the Force and fed it into Vitiate. The world around them began to die before the ritual was finished. The ritual stripped Nathema of all life and all Force energy, leaving behind a void so complete that nothing lived on that world and nothing grew. A scorched world could recover, seeds could take root, and given enough time, life would return on its own. On Nathema, none of that was possible. The Force had been pulled out entirely. The soil itself was lifeless, not dead in the way land dies after a fire, but permanently empty, as if the planet had been hollowed from the inside and left standing only as a shell. Jedi who set foot on the surface centuries later described the sensation as total absence. They felt no dark side energy and no light. The Force had been so completely removed that walking on Nathema was compared to breathing in a room where the air had been drained and not replaced. Nathema stayed empty for more than 1,000 years. Life did not creep back. The dead soil produced nothing, and Force-sensitive visitors felt the void the moment they entered the atmosphere. Patches of vegetation and small creatures eventually began returning during the events of the Nathema conspiracy, and after the fall of Valkorion, the God-King identity Vitiate had built on the distant world of Zakuul. Nathema began healing further, though even those who studied the recovery could not agree on how it was happening. Centuries later, he did it again. And this time, he needed no ritual at all. Ziost, one of the oldest throne worlds of the Sith Empire, was not simply another display of strength. After a coalition of Republic and Imperial forces struck him down on the jungle moon of Yavin 4, Vitiate was weakened and needed a suitable target to replenish himself. Vitiate dominated the free will of beings across the entire planet in real time, possessing soldiers and civilians without being physically present on the surface. Republic forces deployed to Ziost found themselves fighting the very people they'd been sent to protect, as entire military units and sheltering civilians turned without warning. Jedi who resisted his influence watched colleagues turn on them mid-sentence, their eyes emptied and their will replaced. The scale of possession kept growing because each loss of life fed Vitiate more power, and more power let him dominate more minds. The cycle kept building until the planet had nothing left to give. When the cycle reached its peak, the final extraction hit. Ziost was consumed the same way Nathema had been, its surface reduced to gray ash, all life erased, the Force stripped from the world. The Republic could only watch from orbit as the planet died beneath them. Nathema had required a massive ritual with more than 8,000 gathered Sith Lords. Ziost required only Vitiate and the anguish he created from a distance. When weakened, he did not seek a stronger body or a better weapon. Inside a citadel, Vitiate overpowered the most dangerous people alive. In the Legends novel Revan, the confrontation takes place inside the Emperor's own stronghold on Dromund Kaas. Revan, Mitra Surik, the astromech droid T3M4, and Lord Scourge entered together. Revan had survived the Mandalorian Wars and the Jedi Civil War, had fallen to the dark side, and had clawed his way back. Surik had walked away from the Force entirely after the catastrophic final battle of the Mandalorian Wars at Malachor 5, and then reclaimed it through sheer will. Between them, they carried more combat experience than most Jedi would accumulate across several lifetimes. They had planned for the confrontation, coordinated their approach, and entered the citadel together with every advantage they could arrange. Inside that citadel, Vitiate broke them all. The Emperor was already devastatingly powerful, but the moment that secured his victory was Scourge's betrayal. In the middle of the fight, Scourge received a Force vision of an unknown Jedi Knight who would one day bring about the Emperor's true downfall. He realized that neither Revan nor Mitra was that person. Acting on that vision, Scourge struck down Mitra and allowed Revan's capture, gambling centuries of servitude against a future he could barely see. He chose to serve the being he loathed most in the galaxy because the Force had shown him that the right moment had not yet arrived. Scourge accepted the Emperor's reward of immortality, knowing that his only path forward was patience measured in centuries. As the Emperor's wrath, he carried out Vitiate's will across the galaxy for 300 years, eliminating threats to the throne and enforcing the Emperor's commands without hesitation. No one in the Empire suspected that every act of loyalty was a performance. Scourge held the deception in place across lifetimes, watching entire generations rise and fall while he waited for a vision he could never be certain would come true. Vitiate kept Revan alive for 300 years, feeding on his mind the entire time. He sustained a mental link that slowly drained Revan's strength, drawing on his connection to the Force as a continuous source of energy. The link was not passive. Vitiate actively pulled at Revan's memories and his connection to the living Force, draining pieces of him year after year while keeping his body alive through the dark side. Revan remained trapped and aware through all of it. His body kept functioning while his spirit was consumed piece by piece. He could feel the drain and could feel himself becoming less with each passing year. The only presence that reached him was the Force ghost of Mitra Surik, who stayed with him across those centuries and helped him hold on to who he had been. One of the most powerful Jedi the Order had ever trained was reduced to a living battery in a cell that no one in the Republic even knew existed. In the Legends MMO, The Old Republic, Vitiate's ultimate goal was to perform the Nathema ritual on the entire galaxy, consuming all life at once. A Jedi Knight, later known as the Hero of Tython, stopped him before that ritual could be completed, confronting the Emperor directly on Dromund Kaas in a fight that pushed both of them to their limits. The Emperor's voice channeled Vitiate's full strength, and the Jedi Knight who faced him had to draw on everything the Order had taught and everything Scourge had revealed about the Emperor's weaknesses. The confrontation nearly ended the Jedi Knight more than once, and the Emperor fought with a kind of certainty that comes from having dominated every opponent for over a millennium. The Jedi Knight was the one Scourge had seen in his Force vision centuries earlier. Scourge fought alongside the Hero of Tython when the moment finally came, completing the betrayal he had set in motion against Revan and Mitra 300 years before. The centuries of patience had finally produced the exact moment Scourge had been waiting for. Even then, the victory was not permanent. The Emperor's voice was destroyed, but Vitiate's consciousness survived and began searching for a new vessel. Defeating him in direct combat had cost the Jedi Order one of the most difficult battles in its history, and it had only removed one layer of Vitiate's power. None of those feats came from raw strength alone. Nathema required the gathered power of thousands of Sith and may have drawn on Xildrog, an ancient machine tied to the planet that could channel massive concentrations of Force energy. Even Vitiate's most devastating act may have rested on a foundation someone else built. Ziost required a sustained process of domination and chaos before the final consumption could take place. The galactic extinction plan needed years of groundwork. Even the confrontation with Revan and Surik happened inside Vitiate's own citadel on his terms. Every display of Vitiate's power depended on systems, preparation, or positioning that he had arranged long before the moment arrived. The Empire itself was built to feed him. For over 1,000 years, Vitiate ruled from concealment. He governed through the Dark Council for political decisions and through voices that carried his consciousness in host bodies. He also operated through the children of the Emperor, agents placed in positions of trust within the Republic and even the Jedi Order. He rarely appeared and even more rarely spoke. For centuries at a time, the Empire functioned as though its Emperor might not even exist, and that was by design. The Sith who served him spent their lives fighting each other for rank, and every power struggle and betrayal between them generated the kind of anguish Vitiate fed on. The wars against the Republic did the same on a far larger scale. The cycles of conquest and collapse kept entire sectors in a state of permanent unrest, and the suffering produced by those cycles flowed back towards the one being who could draw strength from it. The wars Vitiate started fed him from both sides at once. The Great Galactic War produced suffering on a galactic scale, and every loss of life on either side fed the conditions Vitiate needed to grow stronger. Entire worlds changed hands. The ripple effects reached families who had never seen a blaster fired in their streets, and generations of children grew up with the assumption that the next offensive was always coming. Governments rationed resources and redirected entire economies towards the war effort. A win on one front brought grief and dread across the Republic. A loss on another brought rage and desperation from within his own ranks. Vitiate had no reason to win decisively. A final victory would have ended the war, and ending the war would have shut off the anguish he fed on. The Cold War that followed the Treaty of Coruscant kept that same supply running without open conflict. On contested worlds along the border, settlements lived under the constant possibility of raids from either side. Republic garrisons drilled against offensives that never came. While Imperial outposts held ground, they had no strategic reason to keep. The galaxy stayed too tense to recover and too exhausted to resist. Vitiate withdrew during this period to pursue goals the Dark Council never fully understood, leaving his empire to feed on its own anxiety while he shaped his next identity in secret. The being who had built all of that had started with nothing but his own strength on a world no one in the wider galaxy had ever heard of. Before he was Vitiate, the boy known as Tenebrae conquered his first world before he turned 13. Born on the farming world of Medrius, the child was the illegitimate son of the Sith Lord Drameth and a farmer's wife. By the age of 6, he had killed his stepfather. By 10, he had conquered the surrounding lands through raw terror and dark side strength, tormenting his own mother in the process. When he learned the identity of his true father, he confronted Lord Drameth directly, stripped the older Sith of his connection to the Force, and imprisoned his spirit for 2,000 years. Drameth had been a full Sith Lord, with decades of training and political power behind him. The child who faced him took all of it away in a single encounter. Mark Aragnos, the most powerful Sith Lord of that era, traveled to Medrius and recognized what Tenebrae was. He granted the boy the title of Lord and dominion over the entire world. Ragnos offered no training and no guidance. He left Medrius without attempting to shape what he had found. For the next century, Tenebrae ruled Medrius alone, studying the deeper rituals of the dark side, growing his power far beyond what any single Sith Lord was thought capable of holding. He spent those 100 years mastering techniques that had been forbidden even among the Sith, including methods of severing others from the Force and binding spirits long after death. By the time the Great Hyperspace War ended and the surviving Sith Lords scattered into exile, Tenebrae had already spent a lifetime preparing. He was no longer a child prodigy. He was the most dangerous being in his world, and he had made sure of it. For all the devastation Tenebrae could unleash, he could only reach what stood in front of him. As Vitiate, he ruled for 1,000 years without anyone seeing his true face. He did not hold court or lead armies. He governed through the Dark Council and through voices, host bodies that carried his consciousness and acted with his full authority. If a voice was destroyed, only the vessel fell. The consciousness behind it survived and moved into the next host without interruption. A voice could appear anywhere in the galaxy, speak as the Emperor, and wield the Emperor's Force abilities. No one outside the inner circle would ever know they were speaking to a vessel. The servants of the Emperor maintained this network, managing the transition from one voice to the next and keeping the Emperor's will moving even during the gaps between hosts. The children of the Emperor were even harder to detect. These were people who carried fragments of the Emperor's will inside them without ever knowing it. They lived entire lives in Republic service, trusted and respected by everyone around them before being activated at the moment Vitiate chose. Some held positions within the Jedi Order itself, and others served in Republic intelligence and military command. In the Old Republic, the dangers of the network's full extent become clear only when individual children began surfacing in places no one had thought to look. Destroying a voice only removed the body. Exposing a single child still left hundreds more embedded across the Republic, the military, and the Jedi's own ranks. No one could end Vitiate through direct confrontation, because no one knew where he actually was. Vitiate drained Revan for 300 years through a link that ran both ways. The mental connection Vitiate used to feed on Revan also gave Revan a channel to push back. He fed small hesitations into the Emperor's thinking at critical moments, enough to delay decisions without Vitiate realizing the resistance was there. The Empire's planned offensive against the Republic was postponed by nearly 300 years because of that subtle influence, and Vitiate did not discover the source until after Revan was freed. Even so, 3 centuries of direct contact with Vitiate's mind came at a cost that proved just how deeply the Emperor's power could break a person. The captivity fractured Revan so completely that, as revealed in the Legends expansion Shadow of Revan, his light and dark halves split apart entirely, each half continuing to fight long after the man they had belonged to was gone. Vitiate had held one of the strongest Jedi who ever lived inside his mind for 300 years, and what came out the other side was no longer whole. Valkorion was the most ambitious identity Vitiate ever built, and the longest in the making. He did not simply rename himself and move to a new planet. He found an old Zakuulan civilization and reshaped it over centuries until its history, wealth, military, and mythology revolved around him. He wove himself into the planet's oldest stories, replacing ancient gods and cultural heroes with versions of himself until Zakuul's entire recorded history pointed towards him as his endpoint. He positioned himself as the fulfillment of prophecies his own agents had planted generations earlier, layering the deception so deeply that the people of Zakuul could not separate their own origins from his influence. Zakuul became impossible to imagine without him. The Eternal Fleet, Zakuul's devastating military force, launched a campaign that rapidly crushed both the Republic and the old Sith Empire, striking his deepest korriban, the ancient Sith home world. The fleet moved with a coordination that neither superpower could match, hitting multiple targets in a rolling offensive that left no time for either side to regroup. Republic command centers that had withstood decades of Imperial assault fell within days. Sith strongholds that had never been breached were overwhelmed before reinforcements could arrive. Military leaders on both sides had spent their entire careers planning for threats from each other, and none of them had prepared for a third power that outmatched them both. Neither superpower had known Zakuul existed. By the time it emerged, years of conflict between the Republic and the Sith Empire had already drained both powers to the point where a third force, arriving fresh and fully armed, could overwhelm them before either side could mount a real defense. Zakuul ran on devotion, and that made it unlike anything Vitiate had built before. Many citizens viewed Valkorion as a timeless guide and protector, and their society gave them stability that few civilizations in the galaxy could match. The Knights of Zakuul served because they believed in Valkorion personally, and he had spent generations building that belief. Their force tradition was devoted entirely to him, and service to Valkorion was treated as its highest purpose. The Sith Empire had always run on dread and constant competition for rank, which generated useful conflict but kept the Empire permanently unstable. On Zakuul, citizens did not serve out of obligation. They served because the society Valkorion had designed gave them wealth and stability that no alternative could match. To oppose Valkorion meant rejecting the foundation on which their entire world had been built. The Sith Empire had proved across 1,000 years that subjects held in place by force will eventually turn. On Zakuul, the people defended Valkorion because they believed in him. In the Legends expansion Knights of the Fallen Empire, their loyalty required no enforcement. After Valkorion was struck down by his own son Arkan during the invasion of the Core Worlds, his physical form ended, but the being behind it did not. His consciousness took up residence inside the mind of the Alliance commander known as the Outlander. Vitiate had always embedded himself in the closest available structure and reshaped it from the inside, and the Outlander's mind was simply the next structure in line. Inside the Outlander's mind, Valkorion controlled the terms of their shared existence. He froze time when he chose and reshaped the environment they stood in. At critical moments, he offered surges of raw force power, then pulled them away the instant the Outlander began to rely on them. He decided when to help and when to withdraw, making it clear that the Outlander's survival depended heavily on his willingness to allow it. He would let the Outlander struggle to the edge of failure before stepping in, ensuring that every rescue reinforced who held the real authority inside that shared mind. The Outlander learned quickly that resistance meant silence. Valkorion would pull back completely, leaving the Outlander to face threats alone until cooperation resumed. The cycle trained dependence without ever naming it. Even inside another person's consciousness, stripped of every empire and every ritual, Vitiate could freeze time and reshape reality at will. His own family was not exempt from that control. Valkorion had watched his son Arkan kill his other son Thexan during a military campaign and did nothing to intervene. Vitiate's daughter Valen was so powerful in the Force that he grew wary of what she might one day become. He imprisoned his own daughter and brought her to the surface of Nathema, where the void left by his original ritual limited her abilities and made her more open to conditioning. In the Legends expansion Knights of the Eternal Throne, Valen was trained to respond to a control phrase. Her will bent by the emptiness of a world Vitiate had hollowed out 1,000 years earlier. Valen left Nathema carrying a trigger phrase that could silence her at a word. The void on Nathema suppressed her connection to the Force long enough for the conditioning to take hold. The process was designed to bind her will to a single phrase that could shut down her Force abilities and her resistance in the same instant. She would spend the rest of her life carrying that weakness without knowing its full origin, responding to a command she had no memory of learning. Her raw connection to the Force was growing faster than Vitiate could manage through authority alone, and the same act of consumption that had granted him immortality a millennium earlier was turned into a tool to limit her. Each identity Vitiate built solved one limitation and created the next, leaving no single person with a complete understanding of what he had become. Only when survivors from those separate parts of his life finally stood together could the full picture emerge. The people who finally ended Vitiate had each survived a different layer of his power. Kara Carson had been a child of the Emperor and broken free, carrying the memory of his mental grip as she had felt it from the inside. She knew the exact sensation of losing her own mind to his control and the precise moment when his hold could be broken. Lord Scourge had served as the Emperor's wrath for centuries, close enough to learn how Vitiate thought and where his confidence thinned. His service had been a long deception, endured in silence while he waited for the moment his Force vision had shown him. Satele Shan had spent decades fighting Vitiate's influence across multiple wars, carrying losses that stretched back generations. Revan's long captivity had given him knowledge no willing student could ever gain. The Outlander had survived inside Valkorion's own consciousness, seeing through every identity because the Outlander knew exactly who was wearing them. None of them had volunteered for the knowledge they now held. Each fragment of the understanding had been paid for in years of captivity, loss, or service under false loyalty. The violation of her own mind gave Kira her knowledge. 3 centuries of performing loyalty he did not feel gave Scourge his, and being consumed alive for 300 years gave Revan his. Satele had watched the same darkness outlast every campaign and every alliance she built across decades of war. The Outlander had shared a consciousness with the being behind every mask and watched him try to wear one more. When the end came, in the Legends MMO update Echoes of Oblivion, Vitiate's identities were stripped away in sequence. Valkorion fell first, the God King's authority dismantled by the people his empire had once controlled. The devotion that had sustained Zakuul for centuries was turned against him as the people he had shaped recognized that their protector and their predator had always been the same being. Then Vitiate, the hidden emperor, was pulled out from behind the layers of concealment he had spent a millennium building. The voices were gone, and the children had been exposed. The Dark Council he once used as a shield no longer existed. Finally, Tenebrae, the predator who had consumed a world before he was old enough to rule one, was exposed. Stripped of every mask he had ever worn, the being at the center was laid bare for the first time in thousands of years. He had no voice waiting to receive him, and no network of children to activate. Every structure he had ever relied on was gone. Vitiate built engines of power that ran without him, and that is what separated him from every other Force user the galaxy had ever produced. The galaxy had seen beings with greater raw Force strength, beings who could have overpowered him in a direct contest. Vitiate alone had learned to make his power sustain and multiply itself across 1,000 years, building systems that fed the Force back into him without requiring his presence. The people who ended him had each survived a different part of his reach, and none of them could have done it alone. They stood in the same room, and for the first time since Medrius, that was enough. Vitiate climbed through a Sith hierarchy that ran far deeper than most fans realize, and his contempt for conventional ambition was not unique to him. Nearly every ancient Dark Lord despised what Palpatine eventually became, and the reasons behind that contempt say as much about the Old Order as Vitiate's own story does.